Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Moser, Professor of History and co-chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. Welcome to another edition of Documents in Detail, TeachingAmericanHistory.org's webinar series. In each episode, we do a deep dive into a single document, discussing the historical, literary, and rhetorical aspects of said document, while also analyzing its impact on American history, people, and thought. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is a project of the Ashbrook Center, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization based at Ashland University. We provide a variety of programs and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics, all based on primary source documents. In the next week, you will be receiving an email with a link to request a certificate of participation in this webinar, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. The topics of this year's webinars are drawn from speeches, letters, and writings from the Ashbrook Center's voluminous document database available at tah.org. You can participate in the conversation as well by typing your questions into the chat window at the bottom of your screen at any time. The subject of this evening's program is an excerpt from Theodore Roosevelt's fourth annual message to Congress, better known to us as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And to help discuss it this evening are Dr. Sarah Burns, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and Dr. David Alvis, Associate Professor at Wofford College. Sarah, David, welcome. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, John.
Well, I just want to start with a very general question. What is so important about this document? Why is it worth remembering?
All right. Sarah, did you want to start? You have the floor, Sarah.
Okay. Well, it's the moments after, not moments, but, a few years after America finally defeats a great European power in the Spanish-American War. And so this is really the full-throated decision of the United States government to say, well, now we're going to be one of the main powers in the world, and we're going to make the world, reshape the world and do what we can to make the world adhere to our interests. So it's a fascinating moment of really broad assertions of power.
All right.
Also, just to add to that, in some ways it marks, as Sarah was mentioning, a major transition in America's disposition towards foreign affairs. So traditionally, America had always acted and sort of thought of itself in fairly isolationist terms. I'm not sure isolationism is a perfect word to describe it, but for the most part, they wanted to avoid engagement in European affairs. And so the mark of that, or the doctrine that tended to define America's disposition in foreign affairs was the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine had a spirit of non-intervention. Europeans should not bother us over here in our portion of the hemisphere. We won't bother them over there. So it did have a kind of isolationist, or at least non-interventionist tone, and that really defined American foreign policy until about 1898, when, as Sarah mentioned, we defeat an imperial power and begin to see ourselves as one of the players in great power politics. And what's interesting about the corollary is that it's a very modestly described doctrine. It's suggesting that it's merely a slight appendix to the Monroe Doctrine. But in fact, it's a radical change in foreign policy, because the premise of the corollary is that in order to make sure that European powers don't interfere in Latin America and in this hemisphere, we are going to intervene in the domestic affairs of Latin American countries or other countries in this hemisphere in order to ensure that those European countries are not are not insinuating themselves somewhere, particularly in Latin America. And so that's a dramatic change, because that means now that we are switching from a non-interventionist to an interventionist foreign policy. So Roosevelt's very modest description, it's simply a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, is really misleading. It's a major change in the way, in our understanding of our foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to quote a specific quote that brings that back, where he says, as you're saying is that, this is just sort of a footnote or an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, but he says, for a nation as for an individual to use high-sounding language to proclaim its purpose or to take positions which are ridiculous if unsupported by potential force, and then to refuse to provide that force. So what he's trying to say here, he's saying it's contemptible to say we're going to intervene and we're going to do all these things, and so he's directly calling to Congress to increase the size of the Navy and to upbuild it, as he puts it later on. So it's a radically new way of understanding American power and America's role in the world.
And just one other thing to add to that is, you've got Roosevelt, on the one hand, calling for a very different and robust foreign policy that includes a large naval power, as Sarah mentioned, and intervention in world affairs. But it is interesting how he tries to frame it when it comes to talking about the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine is a sort of sacred touchstone of American foreign policy. And there's a great line in from the fourth annual, from the readings that we had for today, and that is, if you look at from the excerpt that we have, if you look at about 5 lines down, a little bit towards the right there, here's where he describes the corollary. Chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in the general loosening of the ties of civilized society, may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherents of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. So he here is announcing that in order to carry out the Monroe Doctrine, we are going to have to switch strategies towards a much more interventionist strategy. But I would hate to diagram the sentence, because it is the most convoluted and cryptic formulation. And you can see how hesitant he is in trying to change it. He knows that in order to realize the things that Sarah mentioned, you've got to dramatically change American foreign policy and depart from the Monroe Doctrine. But he wants to state it in the most cryptic way possible, in order to make it clear that he's not making a radical departure here.
Right.
Was there a particular event that led to Roosevelt giving this speech?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So, first of all, I do think that Roosevelt is engaged in an interventionist policy and defending it well before 1904. First of all, he's an enthusiast about our conduct during the Spanish-American War, but also, too, in his first annual address in 1901, and then immediately in the following year, 1902, he is defending an interventionist policy and has a broad vision of how foreign policy ought to be conducted in the 20th century. But there is an immediate cause of the corollary, and that is what's known as the Venezuelan Crisis in 1902 and 1903. So, as was commonly the case, you have a number of insolvent countries in Latin America that are highly leveraged in terms of the debt and are not paying, and they're not repaying their loans. And so, 3 countries come together: Britain, Germany, and Italy. Germany is the major force behind this. 3 countries decide to blockade the Venezuelan ports until the Venezuelans agree to repay their debts. Also, too, the the Venezuelans are under the leadership of a fairly demagogic leader at the time named Castro, not the same Castro, but another Castro, who is, if he isn't planning on repudiating the debt, he's not planning on paying it back with any alacrity, and so they end up blockading the ports. Roosevelt threatens them and says, he will allow for the blockade for a little bit, but then they get aggressive and start firing on various forts and threatening to invade. And at this point, Roosevelt really intervenes and says, and tries to stop them, and even sends a fleet of ships under Admiral Dewey down to deal with the matter. He is able to talk them into relenting an attack. Relenting an attack. But and what ends up happening is that the Americans are really responsible for stopping what might have turned out to be a full-scale invasion. And the issue ends up going to arbitration in the World Court, and the Americans, the arbitration court sides with the blockaders. And even though Americans were actually owed a great deal as well by Venezuela, the courts gave preference to Britain, to Germany, and to Italy. And so it turned out to be a really bad deal for us. And so I think at that point, Roosevelt knew, okay, we have to do something, and we're going to have to intervene in these Latin American states if we want to control policy and repayment of debts, and also keep the Europeans out of Latin American countries.
Well, thank you.
I'll add that there were also some more abroad, which is that in 1904 you have the Russo-Japanese War, and Roosevelt himself was very interested in that, and also very interested in maintaining a firewall around that, trying to keep that contained, especially because at the time he was also trying to get an open door policy towards China. So we had more and more interest in the Pacific, and he was trying to make sure that we didn't have a world war break out from that tension between an Asian power and a European power. Furthermore, he was trying to, we were in a time of the world being reshaped, and it was called the first era of globalization. So besides this smaller war, let's say, compared to a world war, but besides the smaller war, we were just a few years after the Hague Convention, which was an effort to try and demilitarize or reduce the arms. And so what Roosevelt is doing is saying, yes, of course, it's really important that we have these institutions. Yes, of course, it's really important that we have a way of reducing the amount of arms and the amount of militarism. But that doesn't mean that we want to get rid of all of our military or get rid of all of our tools for enforcing these things. Because he saw, as we know now, that international law is something where it's not exactly enforceable. And so really the only way that you can move the entire globe in your direction is if you have a sufficiently powerful navy to enforce the norms that you're trying to create. So Roosevelt's really trying to position the United States here as a world reshaper, as the world is being reshaped into this new global order.
So a question from Dustin Baker. Was the U.S. Navy developed enough to uphold the sort of principles that you're talking about here, or is this more aspirational than anything else?
It was part of the reason why Roosevelt was trying to upbuild, as he said, the Navy, is that he saw the growing power of naval forces. And so it wasn't exactly ready at that time to enforce, the norms that Americans wanted to have enforced internationally, but it was getting more and more powerful. And Roosevelt sees it very clearly in the whole speech. He talks about how, not only do you need big, powerful ships, but you also need lighter ships that have more mobility. So it wasn't exactly in the position, but it was moving in the direction of having a very powerful navy. In the build-up of World War I, Woodrow Wilson saw that our navy was not going to be capable of actually really being a force to reckon with. So even, more than 10 years later, the U.S. Navy didn't quite have the force that you would obviously say it has today, which is the capacity to enforce the norms that America wants enforced to a high degree.
Sarah's point, I think, is really important to seeing the overall geopolitical strategy of Theodore Roosevelt. So, as Sarah's mentioned, Roosevelt is investing a huge amount of financial resources in building the Navy, and in doing so at a very rapid pace. So there was an intellectual at the time, Alfred Mayer, who argued, look, what really makes for great powers is their navies. And the big naval powers at the time are Britain, France to some degree, Germany, and still to some degree Japan. And for Roosevelt, the primary concern was the aggressive development of the Navy by Germany. And so the key was holding off Germany. So, for instance, if you look at the Roosevelt's interest in mediating a solution to the Russo-Japanese War, if I remember correctly, the British are aligned with the Japanese, the French are aligned with the Russians. And if that conflict continues, what's going to happen is that you're going to set off the French against the British, and ultimately the Germans will rise to a much greater naval power because they're in a sort of entente at the time and enjoying the benefits of an entente. So for Roosevelt, that is a really serious threat. And so investing in that Navy is critical. And the other critical thing that obviously inspires part of the interest in the Corollary is, in order to have a very effective Navy, you've got to be efficient both on the Atlantic side and on the Pacific side. And you really need a quick way between the two. And so this is why the Panama Canal is the lifeline for the Navy. It's without that, it's really going to be hard for the United States and for the Americas to be able to have an effective Navy that can match the other great powers, particularly Germany. And so this is why there's this major concern about European powers in the Caribbean. It's probably not the deaths or even their intervention in domestic affairs of Latin American countries. It's the possibility of their presence in the Caribbean and near the Panama Canal, which could really threaten Roosevelt's grand strategy here.
Okay. So, I saw you mentioned Alfred Thayer Mahan's naval theory as being an influence on Roosevelt. Were there other inspirations? Who else shaped Roosevelt's international ideas?
One of the major influences that I would make the case over and over again, because I spent a good portion of my life writing about it, is this public intellectual, Herbert Croly. So besides, and Sarah mentioned this already, besides the geopolitical strategy, there's also two, you might call it more of a philosophical strategy behind Roosevelt's building up of the Navy and his concern with transitioning our foreign policy from isolationism to interventionism, or becoming an international police power. And that is, for Roosevelt, there's a moral imperative here, and that is until Americans can take their responsibility in the world seriously, they won't understand that life is about duties rather than rights. And here, Roosevelt is very much inspired by this public intellectual, Herbert Croly. And Croly's argument is, if you want a serious country, you've got to have a certain nationalism that prefers the collective good over the individual interest. And by transitioning towards a foreign policy of being an international police keeper, that concentrates your country's energy on thinking of itself as a collective whole rather than just a group of isolated individuals. So in some ways, this is TR's really important shift in domestic policy. You know, the way to deal with greedy corporations and the problems of labor versus employment is to get away from the notion that society is a collection of self-interested individuals whose problems can be reconciled by lawsuits or by the rule of law. We need to become a nation that thinks about the collective good first and only the individual self-interest secondarily. And so the international vision of TR really in some ways serves also the domestic goal, and that is creating a stronger sense of national community and then seeing yourself as having responsibilities in the world, including the responsibility to transform what he would call savage or barbaric peoples into a higher level of civilization. And when Americans feel that they have that responsibility, that's when they take their duties seriously.
Yeah, I think he has a very, Hamiltonian perspective on America's role in the world. So we see, Alexander Hamilton always kind of argued for America being poised to be this great empire, this great commercial empire. And we see Teddy Roosevelt carrying that through at a moment of opportunity when that could be really realized. Because the United States at this point had really industrialized, so the commercial capital of the U.S. was, it was like a hockey stick of growth after the Civil War, the full industrialization. And so now we have this grand commercial empire. We're poised to, in 1904, the Panama Canal was being constructed by the U.S., but it wasn't quite built yet. And so we had all of these amazing opportunities, not only for naval defense, but also for commercial prosperity. And so we see the realization of one flow-through of the American psyche, right? That flow-through of greatness and the togetherness, right? One common cause of like liberty and happiness. And carrying that through with commercial prospects of increasing one's wealth and therefore the prosperity that goes along with that. So it's all, one strain of American thought, and it's that isolationist strain and the idea of the American fortress and staying within our realm. And so I think he's following in that tradition.
So the focus on Latin America is more a tactic, it seems, than anything else. That this is just because he wants to appear less radical. He wants to show that this is just a natural flourish, a natural expansion of the Roosevelt Corollary. But he's setting his sights, is it fair to say, on far more than simply Latin America?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, I think because Latin America still looked a little bit like it was not exactly up for grabs because there were so many independence movements in Latin America at the time. But because of the building of the canal and because of all the still opportunity and resource collection in Latin America and the
What's happening?
What's going on?
I don't know.
Oh.
I never said that. Never gave that.
Somebody have a mic that needs to be muted? Hello?
Hello?
Okay. Maybe that's done. Let's hope so.
No, it's
Mike, I think
everything's falling apart on this webinar, and no technology is working
someone's
correctly,
saying
and none of the panelists.
Well, this is live television, ladies and gentlemen. We don't know what we're going to get. I think Michaela, we can hear you, and I don't know if you can hear us. So let's see if we can continue. So we have a question from one of our participants. At what point did Roosevelt send the Great White Fleet around the world, and to what extent is that attached to what he's saying here?
Yeah, I have no idea why all these things are working.
Let me just get the text. So it's 1907.
Tell me how my hug was.
Okay.
Not as good
So it's 1907 to 1909. So this is after he has gone to Congress really hard.
I'll be honest. It was really quick.
You have to elevate.
Okay. There you go.
Yeah, so it was a few years after this, so this was after the buildup of the Navy
Okay.
that he sent the Great
Oh,
Lakes.
shoot.
And so I suspect that part of that was also, as I recall, but I won't say this for sure, but maybe David knows. As I recall, he said to Congress, I have enough money. So he said to Congress, I want to send the fleet around so everyone sees American power. And then Congress said, well, look, you don't have the funds for that, and we don't have the funds as a nation. And so he came back to them and quipped, I have enough money to get them to the Pacific, just not to get back.
Right.
So if you don't want to fund them, and thus began a tradition of, of American presidents saying, here, Congress, here's the fait accompli. What do you want to do with it? By the way, our boys are out there.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big benefits of the Great White Fleet, I mean, just as Sarah described it, is the opportunity to use unilateral executive power. I mean, so another thing that attracts TR to international politics is there the president has a lot more discretion when it comes, and also to a lot more opportunities to utilize unilateral actions. And you don't have to depend upon the pesky interests of Congress. And Roosevelt's relationships with Congress were always very testy, primarily because his own political party at the time is divided between some progressive insurgents on the one side and then a lot of old school, what you call stand-patter Republicans on the other. Roosevelt had constant difficulties in trying to deal with Congress, whether it was a matter of foreign policy or domestic policy. And one of his major themes as president is the president is the steward of the people. And he always proudly points out that I never acted against any prescription in the Constitution, but I certainly expanded the use of executive power. And the reason for emphasizing executive power is it allows you to get out of having to work with Congress and with all of its divisions in its interests. And so the Great White Fleet was a great opportunity to wield unilateral executive power in an area where Congress generally fears to tread, and that is in foreign affairs. So not only could you make a bold statement of what the status of America is as a great power. Right now we are a great power. We're sending across the Great White Fleet. So you not only accomplish that, but you also illustrate to Congress how much authority the president can really wield unilaterally and set policy. And so the fact that Congress had to pick up the second half of this bill is a great illustration of what the relationship in the future between the president and Congress is going to look like.
Yeah, it's also in the exact same way that the world is being reshaped, the understanding about the American Constitution, what it is that presidents should be able to do and how they should interact with the people was fundamentally changing. And so for us today, it's very easy to think of a president who's powerful and verbally confident and talking to the people directly. In Roosevelt's time, that was still developing as a concept, as an aspect of presidential power. And also, even more shocking or staggering for us now, Congress really did stuff, and Congress really pushed back against the president. And so as TR is trying to assert this brand new foreign policy, and also, as Nathan was pointing out earlier, he was reshaping domestic policy as well, because you have all these labor disputes and complications with, the first Gilded Age. And so he's doing all of this and, running up against impediments in Congress. And so what he's trying to do a little bit is unhook the presidency from the restraints that were created by the legislative branch and trying to then pull it out and pull out more and more unilateral power. And as David said, he didn't, let's say, break the Constitution, but he certainly stretched the Constitution and stretched the idea of executive power in order to do all of this.
So, in that same vein, one of our participants tonight says that it's one of the features of the progressive era was the importance of having some kind of crisis to define a great presidency. could the corollary almost be seen as not just a way to exert executive authority, but even to precipitate a possible crisis that might put him in the same category as a president such as Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in talking about in the broader, in the whole document, which, I won't get off track, but in the broader document, he does talk about the crisis of the Far East and trying to circumscribe the theater and trying to keep it there. And as David was saying, there were alliances amongst the two powers that were fighting with other European powers, and those other European powers were elsewhere in the world. So there was every opportunity, you could say, from his more muted versions of emergency than we have today. But from his description, you can see that he's trying to position them as saying there's a possible, maybe not emergency, but exigent circumstance that I have to address. So we have to have the military and the capacity to address those things.
One of the things that Theodore Roosevelt always complains about in his diary is that he doesn't have a crisis like the Civil War, so that he knows that he's always short in his, he always invokes Lincoln, right? And he is the heir of Lincoln, but he knows that his analogy always falls short, primarily because he doesn't have a Civil War. And so he mentions this as a regular problem. Without a crisis like the Civil War, it's hard to rise to the level of greatness. And in terms of American politics, I teach American politics, and I find it interesting in certain ways. But at the end of the day, even the domestic affairs of the U.S. At the turn of the century, regulating trusts and resolving labor disputes, they're boring. At the end of the day, they're not exciting issues. This is not the stuff of which great presidents are made, and he knows that. Now, on the other hand, Latin American politics is really a fun. They're in what at that time was described as banana republics. There you had really dramatic issues going on. So if you could extend the sphere of politics to the domestic affairs of other nations and make it an incumbent duty on Americans to undertake as their responsibility transitioning these people from a savage and barbaric state, those are TR's words, from a savage and barbaric state into a higher level of civilization, then you have the opportunity to do something that is dramatic. You're dealing, with each Latin republic, you're dealing on a daily basis with a crisis. And every time TR is dealing with a Latin American republic, even on, treaties involving a canal, there's always a revolution taking place.
Yeah.
And so it does make much more for dramatic theater and a much more a politics in which you're engaged in much more fundamental questions. In American domestic politics, you're engaged in at best small questions.
Yeah, the director that about the film to read through and take the film in Spanish. He says, this thing about reshaping or helping quote unquote civilize a bunch of people. That is and we are endeavoring to develop natives themselves so that they shall take ever increasing share in their own government. And as far as we are already admitting their representatives to governmental equality with our own. So he prior to that talked about how there's some similarities with our, let's say, semi-imperialism and the imperialism of other civilized nations, except that what we're doing is making other people better, right? Aren't we great for reshaping the world and reshaping a better group of people who have the capacity to free themselves and to have a free government and have the life-saving property that we enjoy now. So it's a much bigger world when he gets to run it and change it, right? Rather than because he doesn't have the crises that they would say. So he has to find a way to become great.
I had once read that it drove Roosevelt to distraction that the guy who's president when there's actually a war that breaks out in Europe is Woodrow Wilson. But what you're saying about about this need to what America is doing is better than what other countries are involved in. This leads me to something I've been wanting to ask about American exceptionalism. The original Monroe Doctrine is a classic statement of American exceptionalism. It talks about their system over there has no place over here, and any attempt to bring it over here is going to be regarded as an unfriendly act. Roosevelt, though, doesn't seem to be using those terms. It's almost like the United States is now ready to join the ranks of the great powers, but we're going to be focused on Latin America because that's our traditional sphere of influence. Just as, say, Austria-Hungary has, or and Russia have the Balkans, or Great Britain might have the Low Countries, or what have you. What does Theodore Roosevelt believe in American exceptionalism?
Yeah, I think he believes in it insofar as, America's exceptional just in the same way that the British are exceptional, just in the same way that the Germans are exceptional. In other words, great powers are exceptional, but they're all the same when it comes to the fact that they're great powers, insofar as they can transform uncivilized places into higher levels of civilization. That's their real calling, and so there's an underlying thesis for Roosevelt that really, I know that occasionally he does claim American exceptionalism, but there's an underlying thesis in his vision of the world that makes exceptionalism really impossible as American exceptionalism. And that is the underlying thesis of his argument about the world leadership is there is a particular race of people that are better than others and therefore have a moral duty to help others become better. And that is the Teutonic peoples. For Roosevelt, there is a specific race theory, so there's nothing exceptional about America except that it is heavily populated and determined by the Teutonic race. And really, the transformation of the world comes not through something exceptional to America, but something exceptional to the Teutonic race. So therefore, it's really, in that terms, it's really hard to see, the real distinction between what America brings to the table versus what the Anglo-Saxons and Britain brings to the table versus what the Germans bring to the table.
Yeah, I do think we have to emphasize. So I would say to me it's an open question and maybe a clearer understanding of it. But to bring it back, so in the 18th century, a lot of people talked about virtuous republic, right? The importance of virtue and the importance of that in making solid and self-governing. And so you have people like Brutus and Cato like claiming that we need to have virtue in America, and then you have people like Hamilton and Madison who are like, yes, like virtue is important and everything. But there's these other aspects of a republic that we really have to focus on and fix and regulate. So I think in the same kind of way, Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt, I think, talks in the language of exceptionalism, but thinks that I agree with here, thinks in the language of like racial exception and the exceptionalism of the European race in general, and then the Teutonic race, or like particularly, especially the Anglo-Saxon part. So that's where there's a subtlety to me there that I'm not quite sure whether he buys into those projects or whether he's using that rhetoric because he knows that brings a lot of people along with him.
So how was this speech received?
The state of the fourth annual message?
Yes. Well, this part anyway.
Well, you still had very strong isolationist tendencies in the United States, and so they were pushing back pretty hard against any efforts of the U.S. to try and move outside the sphere, right? So especially after the Spanish-American War, you have a lot of people saying, great, now we don't have to go anywhere else, right? We've gotten as far as we can go. We don't need to be like the European imperialists. We don't want to go down that road. because there's the old Whig philosophy that down the road of offensive war and down the road of a larger territory lies tyranny, right? And so necessarily, the more expansionist you are, you will become less free, and there's no way around it. So all of those forces are still really in power when TR is giving this address, and so he's really battling against them, especially in the legislature. There was still a very, very, very isolationist legislature that, eventually came up against Woodrow Wilson in his earlier years.
At this time, the chief dogma of the Republican Party, in terms of the people who are actually in charge of the leadership, is high tariff walls and isolationism, and they go hand in hand. You keep as long as we produce here, people will need our goods, and that is our primary interaction with others. And other than that, what happens in the rest of the world doesn't really matter to us. And this is why the Republicans at this time felt perfectly comfortable with very, very high tariff walls. It was about protecting U.S. interests, not turning abroad. And one of the arguments that the progressives are trying to make is that your economy won't be so great if you don't become involved in opening up the foreign markets and becoming engaged in the domestic affairs of other nations. Because their success really, your success will depend upon their success. So there is also, too, a sort of global economy argument going on between the two sides. So I think that's the reaction to Roosevelt's speech would have been horrifying to the Republican leadership, but to progressives who saw the future as markets, finding new markets abroad, this was very attractive.
Yeah, I think that's also partially why he has such an interesting place in history, because you always see presidents who actually do appeal to a variety of different groups are less well liked or less well revered because they kind of steal a little bit from the left and steal a little bit from the right and move us in a direction that is kind of a consensus place. But because of that, because they're not firmly on one side or the other, then there's lots of animosity for certain things they've done, right? So that's also one of the problems TR has, is that he was such a great president in moving us in a direction of integrating with the globe, but remaining true to American values to a certain extent. That he didn't like the people who had more traditional understandings of American isolationism didn't totally like it. The people who really wanted us to be like this global community with no munitions and lots of peacefulness didn't like that he still wanted a really strong leader. So he helped on both sides, or he had friends on both sides, but he was also an antagonist to so many people, so many groups that were powerful.
Yeah, certainly his vision of international relations doesn't seem. I don't see Robert La Follette or other progressives of the Upper Midwest having the same warm feeling for this as maybe the Northeastern Northeastern progressives that Roosevelt represents, right?
Yeah, I mean, this would have horrified people, populists, like William Jennings Bryan, right?
Sure.
So populist reformers on the left as well.
I'm wondering if we couldn't mention William Howard Taft's dollar diplomacy speech.
Yeah.
Of course, this emphasizes the role of commercial development and in loans to modern diplomacy. To what extent do you see dollar diplomacy as an extension of what Roosevelt's talking about, or might it actually be a repudiation?
Oh, yeah, looking back at this speech again in preparation for our webinar tonight, I was thinking about that in terms of what is the relationship between dollar diplomacy and Roosevelt's corollary. And on the one hand, it is perfectly in line with what Roosevelt argues for. That is, the goal here is to resolve problems both internally or between developing countries, to resolve it by becoming involved in their domestic affairs, but only in one way, and that is loaning money. And so what is designed, it's classic Taft in one way, and that is doing exactly what Theodore Roosevelt would have done, but making it boring. That's in some ways, what Taft really wants to do is make Theodore Roosevelt palatable to the Republican leadership. And dollar diplomacy looks more in line with their business interests. Okay. This is not going to be politics. We're not going to be sending down militaries. We're not going to be building gigantic canals, but we are going to be loaning money. But that sounds more like you're just turning the corollary into you're turning interventionism into just a business. And in some ways, that's kind of always how Taft likes to work, right? Follow TR's thinking, but make it something acceptable to the Republican leadership. Same way with Taft and trust busting. I mean, many people know now, right, that the biggest trust buster, the biggest prosecutor of the trust is Taft, not Theodore Roosevelt. But Taft made trust busting boring by just prosecuting every single trust instead of picking and choosing who's an enemy of the state and who's not. And so in some ways, what he does is tone down a strong executive wielding unilateral power and just makes this a routine part of the business of government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also that, TR was, to continue on that string, TR was all for increasing our commercial interrelations with a variety of other countries. And I don't think it would be antithetical to anything TR was thinking that you would use, what you could call either economic warfare, economic carrots and sticks, right? To get people to abide by the rules that you would like and get them to be interconnected with you. At the same time, there's a movement away in Taft from the undeniable manly virtue of war that you see throughout the Roosevelt Corollary. Right? It's right at the front where he talks all about our manly obligations and all these kinds of things. So Taft, as David I think very well said, it's like drained all of the testosterone out of what it is that TR was trying to do and made it very sensible and economic, right?
He's a mollycoddle, as Roosevelt would say. But looking at the last paragraphs of this, I can't help but be struck by how classically progressive this sounds. A number of great guiding principles were laid down early in the history of this government. The recent task of our diplomacy has been to adjust those principles to the conditions of today, to develop their corollaries, to find practical applications of the old principles expanded to meet new situations. So, we don't have a whole lot of time left. I'm wondering if you could each make your best pitch. We've got a group of 50-some, presumably teachers out there. Give your best pitch for why they should be having their students read this document.
I think it's really interesting to watch how it is that TR has to convince Congress to pay for a large military and convince Americans that what they want to do is be integrated into the world order. Because at this stage, we're so integrated into the world order, and our president, to continue on that strain, our president is so powerful, and Congress is so supine, that just the idea that there was a need to bring them along and to bring them into your project, let alone tell the American people that it's probably a good thing that we're integrated into the world, right? This is not something that we hear from presidents today, and it's not something that we're used to as a way of our political branches interacting. So it's really nice to see all of these questions at the first global moment. Because as I mentioned before, this was the first era, considered to be the first era of globalization. So you can see, besides those differences, a lot of similarities with, how is it that we want to integrate with the international community? What do we want to do with our military? How do we want to engage in commerce? What markets are open to us? What should we do about China? All of these questions are perennial, as well as developing as anew at this moment. So it's both concerns that are new from this moment in American history and concerns that we consistently have.
Very nice. David?
I would say the importance of studying the Roosevelt and studying the primary speeches and how someone like Roosevelt thinks about America's role in the world, I think it would be very helpful to students because most of us and most students today simply assume that America has a duty to be an international police keeper in the world. And that may or may not be right, depending on what the underlying moral assumption is there. And I think it's important to say, well, what is the moral assumption? Why does America serve that role? What are we trying to achieve? Because when you simply say, well, we should help with this situation or that situation, you do have to ask yourself, what's the end goal? What's the purpose? And by studying Roosevelt, I think you really see, okay, this is one of the reasons America now occupies this place. This was the end goal. This is the purpose. This is the direction. And I think that until you look at the moral premise behind it by looking at these primary documents, it's really going to be impossible to assess what America's role in the world ought to be, and also if it's doing that role well.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for a fascinating conversation, and I would like to thank our participants for their questions. Just to remind you, you'll all be receiving within the next week an email containing a link. If you would like to receive a certificate of participation, all you need to do is click on that link. If you have enjoyed this evening's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through Ashland University and the Ashbrook Center. These are offered as part of a Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can find more information about our course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org. I am chair of that particular program, so it is obviously near and dear to my heart. You can help us spread the word about the MAG program and all of our teacher programs by sharing that link, which you're going to be receiving in the next week. Please share that with your colleagues as well as on social media. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will be taking place on Wednesday, March 20th. And our subject on that evening will be Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points Address. At that time, I will be joined by Dr. Thomas Knock of Southern Methodist University and Dr. David Krugler of the University of Wisconsin at Platteville. The recommended readings for that webinar have already been posted. We hope to see you back here on March 20th. Until then, have a wonderful evening.